Okay, well, I want to thank Professor Misapu, who's a longtime friend, for organizing this, and Gloria, too, who's helped with the practicalities of us getting together. Um, and I also want to thank all of you for coming, especially those of you who watch EWTN, because it's a very, before we get into the martyrs, it's a very funny experience to be on TV a lot because people come up to you and say, "Oh, I just loved what you said the other day," and sometimes you don't remember what you said the other day. And it leads to these crazy circumstances. I was at a Saturday mass once in my own parish, and I was walking out, and in front of the church, a very nice couple came up to me and said, "Hey, it's great to see you, but what are you doing here?" And I had to inform them that I lived there, and that was my parish too. It's like if you're on TV, somehow you don't exist in the world. And it's not always the case that people. I was telling Bob and Consuela at lunch today. It's not always the case that people I meet are like most of the people I think in this room, that they're grateful to see the Catholic thing, or they're grateful to see us on EWTN. I was coming out of the oratory in London a few years ago, and a guy with a very strange look on his face came up to me, and he said, "You look like that guy I see on TV a lot." And I looked at him and I said, "What do you think of that guy?" He said, "Oh, I like him." I said, "Well, yeah, that's me." Because not everyone does. And I hear about it. Look, we're here today, thanks primarily to Aid to the Church in Need USA, which is an organization that's right over here in Brooklyn. I had no intention really of writing this book. I had a lot of other projects in mind, but Aid to the Church in Need decided that for the Jubilee year, they wanted to have another book because they support Christians and others actually around the world who are being persecuted and sadly, in many cases, even martyred. So I encourage you, if you don't know about Aid to the Church in Need, it's a global organization with, I think, 35 different national offices. I was just in Lisbon in Portugal, where they translated this book into Portuguese. Then I was in Rome, where it's also been translated into Italian. And this is the one organization that I'm familiar with. It's private. It's a papal foundation, but it actually, I think, operates more like a private nonprofit than almost anything else I know. And it's the most effective tool that's out there. And of course, there are others. The Knights of Columbus are out there, and Catholic Near East, and other organizations. And I really want to encourage you, before we get into any of the discussion, to recognize these groups and do something with them if you can. Support them financially, or just help distribute their material, because our fellow Christians around the world are being persecuted and martyred in record numbers. Now, I've been told that I've said, I don't remember ever saying this, but I've been told that I've said that more people were martyred in the 20th century than all the previous centuries combined. It's probably true. It's actually probably true. It's also the case that somewhere above 300 million Christians right today. This isn't an ancient story of the Roman Empire. 300 million Christians today are under threat of persecution and often enough martyrdom. So this is not a small matter. And if we as Christians don't take seriously what's happening to our own brothers and sisters, who's going to do it? So I really want to encourage you. This presentation is going to be informative, but I hope it will also encourage you to learn more and to do more about these persecuted Christians around us. Now, let me just talk about how this book came to be written. Nietzsche says somewhere, I think it's in Thus Spake Zarathustra, that every idea has its autobiography. I don't know if that's true, but in this particular case, this book does have an autobiography, because I wrote a previous book called The Catholic Martyrs of the 20th Century, which came out in 2000. I handed a copy of it to John Paul II on May 7, 2000. He decided that for the Jubilee year of 2000, he wanted to have a commemoration of all the Christian martyrs of the 20th century, Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox. And there were various events in 2000. There was a huge celebration of the martyrs at the Colosseum on May 7, the evening after I gave the Holy Father a copy of the book. And it was really for me, it was a very moving experience. Sometimes people ask me, a woman once asked me when I gave a lecture about the previous book, if I wasn't depressed reading about all these people and the terrible ways that they sometimes are tortured and humiliated, etc. And I looked at her and I said, it never crossed my mind the whole time I was doing the research because I had never spent so much time with holy and heroic people who very often, even as they were about to be shot, were praying for and forgiving the people who were about to kill them. This is an amazing witness that even in our time, there are people willing to die for the Catholic faith and in large numbers, in spite of all the threats that are around us. So anyway, that was 2000. And Aid to the Church in Need asked me about 2 years ago, would you do a second edition of that book? So as scholars know, as if you go back and you have to do a second edition, you got to check all the footnotes and how did I explain? It's immensely more difficult than writing a new book, which eventually is what we decided to do. So that's why you have this book. The previous one was thick because it was a whole century. This one is a little thinner because it's only been 25 years. And Aid to the Church in Need, decided, because Pope Francis decided that he wanted to reproduce what John Paul II did back in 2000 for the Jubilee year of 2025. And so, we hastened to get this whole thing ready, to get it into print. We had 500 copies shipped over to Rome, and the Pope died. So all the events that we had planned didn't come to fruition, but the book is in existence and it's getting around now. And I thank God in a way, and I thank Aid to the Church in Need in particular, because this needed to be written, because it's already the case that we are in a new moment. And that's what I'm largely going to talk about. If you look at the martyrs of the 20th century, the largest number by far were produced by totalitarianism, political atheism, basically. Communism, fascism, and Nazism. And communism by far over all the others. When my first book came out, it was reviewed in the Washington Post, if you can believe that. I actually got them to review this. It was a different Washington Post back then. People complained to me that I focused too much on communist martyrs. And I would always tell them, well, what do you want me to do? I mean, the communists killed 100 million people in the 20th century, and a lot of them were Christians. Yeah, I mean, it was terrible the way that priests and other Christians were rounded up by the Nazis, the fascists, persecuted. Any authoritarian regime dislikes religion, serious religion, because serious religion represents a threat and an alternative to the monopoly that they want to have on their societies. So it's not surprising that Christians and others, fall afoul of these regimes. But that was the picture for the 20th century. That was before 9/11. Anybody who looks into the situation of Christians in the world today, persecuted Christians, there are still countries. North Korea is the worst persecutor by far. It's such a strong persecutor that we hardly even know what happens inside of North Korea. China, of course, is still persecuting various religions. I'll talk a bit more in detail about that as we get to it. And there's more minor persecution in Vietnam and a few other places. Latin America is still a bit of a problem. Venezuela was a big problem before Maduro was removed from office. Nicaragua continues to be a problem. Nicaragua probably the worst of all in Latin America, and Cuba as well. But things have changed now. If you have to point to what is the major threat to Christians around the world, other than those specific countries that I just mentioned, it's radical Islam. That's the difference between it's radical Islam. You got it. So that's the difference between the 20th century and the 21st century to this point. Salman Rushdie, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Salman Rushdie. He was at one time a very famous, I think, Pakistani British novelist, a kind of a magical realist novelist, not a realist, but there's a kind of a genre of novels called magical realism, where, improbable things happen. But he wrote a book called The Satanic Verses. And the Satanic Verses, in particular, exist in the Quran. And what they tell is that Muhammad there's some dispute whether they belong in there or not, but that's another question. The question, they tell that Muhammad was willing to let some of his followers worship polytheistic gods, in other words, many gods, temporarily in order to gain some advantage. So it looked like he had actually compromised his own principles for the sake of, whatever practical advantage he would gain out of it. So when he published this book, which I have to say, I mean, it's not a screed against Islam. The Ayatollah Khomeini, the previous one, not the recent one that was bombed and killed, issued a fatwa against him. In other words, a directive that any pious Muslim was licensed to kill him. Now, he wasn't killed. Fortunately for him, Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister of England, and the Iron Lady protected him during those days. But he was stabbed several times up here in Chautauqua, New York, just a couple of years ago. It's 30 years after the fatwa was issued. And he lost one eye. And this is what he said. He said afterwards, and I want to say again, he came from a partly Muslim background, although I don't think he's Muslim right now. He said, after having overcome fascism, Nazism, and Stalinism, the world now faces a new totalitarian global threat, Islamism. In other words, radical Islam that isn't just a very conservative form of religious belief. It actually has, as all Islam actually has, it has a political element. And this particular political element is, as I'll explain a little bit later, it's intended to reestablish the caliphate, the political domination of Islamic rule and Sharia law in the world, pure and simple. So a new totalitarianism. Okay, that's the general background of these two books, and I think that's probably sufficiently clear. I want to, before I go any further, though, I want to just briefly explain what a martyr is in Christian terms. Maybe you think you know what this is, but I think just give me a minute, stay with me, and I think you'll see that this is important. I was in the bookstore in Union Station in Washington, D.C., and there was a book, Martyr. I said, oh, yeah, I looked at it, and it was about Muslims who were being persecuted by whoever they think they're being persecuted by. You couldn't find a book about Christian martyrs in a general bookstore these days. It's would be utterly impossible. But I want to bring out for you, there's been a development. There have been actually 3 separate categories, I would put it, of martyrs that the church has defined in recent years, okay? The classic definition is someone who dies in odium fidei, out of hatred of the faith. That's primarily what we think about when we look back at the Roman Empire, and Christians are thrown to the lions and they're tortured and they're put on hot gridirons and all that stuff that we kind of absorb as Christians from our early history. And what I want to point out, though, about this is that it isn't exactly a theological difference. It isn't exactly like the ancient Romans said, well, now, wait a minute. You guys say you have a Trinity and we believe in, however many gods the Romans believed in. Yeah, there is kind of that, because the gods of certain types of regimes are what reinforce the regime. But in particular, what the Romans didn't like about Christians was, again, this fact that they were an alternative society. And Romans were very much vigilant about keeping that massive empire together. And so they stamped out a lot of little groups that, that might present a challenge to them. So it wasn't exactly theological, but we do call it in odium fidei. And that term basically persisted down to modern times. Okay. The next development was by John Paul II. When I was writing that first book about the martyrs, I would have been writing probably in 1998, 1999 for the publication in 2000. John Paul II started to talk about I nuovi martiri in Italian, the new martyrs. In fact, the office where I found the files for that earlier book was on the Tiber Island. If you've ever been in Rome, there's an island right in the Tiber River. And it was in the basement of the St. Bartholomew Church there was the commission per I nuovi martiri, for the new martyrs. And by this, John Paul II really recognized something new about the modern world. Now, in a rough way, you had an analogy with these totalitarian between the totalitarian regimes in ancient Rome, because the totalitarians wanted to control everything. They wanted no resistance to their rule. But for example, there's a famous case of a Father Pino Pugliese, I think his name was, a priest in Sicily, who was killed by the mob. People get killed by the mob all the time. So what? What John Paul recognized is there are times when if you are carrying out what to an outsider might look like a secular activity, but you are doing it out of your Catholic faith, you would be one of these new martyrs. And let me just look here, as we'll talk about him. Yeah, here's an interesting case too. So that was that priest, and the priest I think was trying to protect the local people in Sicily from the mafia, which was trying to control the water supply and charge, the usual ripoffs that the mob was doing in those days. Rosario Livatino is a very famous case, also in Sicily. He was a judge. Started out as a lawyer, obviously, and was very committed to his Catholic faith. In fact, there was a Rosario Livatino center, I think, in Trapani, that now perpetuates his work. And he wrote a lot about how the work he was doing, the anti-mafia work that he was doing, was his own deep expression of Catholic social thought. That Catholic social thought has its particular ethical concerns, abortion, etc. But it also has a concern for generalized order, law and order, and justice in society. So even as a judge, he would write and speak about how he was doing these things because of his Catholic faith, not solely because of his position as a judge in Sicily. Well, naturally, one thing leads to another. He's driving to work one day, he gets run off the road by some mobsters and gets shot and gets killed. And so I'm hoping that the church at some point declares him a saint, a martyr, because I think that's what he was, and I think it fits under that category of I nuovi martiri that John Paul II was talking about. But it's an interesting category because there are a lot of different circumstances in which this sort of thing will apply, and I'll apply some of them in a minute. There's a third development, though, and this was carried out by Pope Francis. Pope Francis, in particular, was sensitive to the question of how in the modern world, a lot of times circumstances just erupt and someone gets killed. Now, Livatino, got up every day, went to work, did his job as judge and as a lawyer, and, you could see that he was engaged in one way or another. But Francis said there's probably need a third category, and so far as I can make out from the documentation, this hasn't yet been established as a category for martyrs. In fact, they kind of say, well, this isn't really martyrs unless there's other stuff involved in it. What he used was a Latin phrase called oblatio vitae, the offering of your life. And what he meant by that was an offering of your life on the spur of the moment. And here's a case I want to look at. Akash Bashir. Akash Bashir was a Catholic, I guess we could call him kind of security guard in Lahore, Pakistan. And on one of the major feasts, I can't remember whether it was Palm Sunday or Easter Sunday. I think it was Palm Sunday. In 2016, he was outside of a church in Lahore, and a Muslim suicide bomber rushed the church. There were 1,500 people inside that church. And if that bomber had gotten in, who knows how many hundreds of people might have been killed or maimed. But on the spur of the moment, Akash Bashir practiced oblatio vitae, the offering of his life, and grabbed this person. It was a woman, actually, a Muslim woman, grabbed her and said to her, I will die, but you won't enter. Bomb went off, it killed him and I think several dozen people around him. but she didn't get into the church. Now, this category, I think we're going to hear more and more about because, these things happen where people are forced on the spur of the moment to present themselves as Christians and to risk their own lives. But I wanted to bring this up because I think that unless we understand how the church is kind of developed in confrontation with what's going on in the world, we won't understand entirely what modern martyrdom is all about. And I've been studying this for a long time, and I'm kind of impressed at the way that recent popes have looked at this. Benedict also had some comments about martyrdom, and Leo has actually been talking about the widespread persecution of Christians around the world in many places. So this is helpful to us. One last word about what a martyr means. I mean, people die for all sorts of things. People died for communism. There are Muslims who consider themselves martyrs when they are actually suicide bombers. And we want to be clear as Christians that a martyr isn't simply somebody who dies for a cause. I mean, that could be the stupidest thing that a person does. It might be a crazy cause. A Christian martyr, at least, is somebody who imitates Christ. There's a difference between, it's harsh to say this in some ways because not all Muslims, of course, are radical Muslims, but Christ is an example of somebody who died to redeem the world. Muhammad was a warlord. And if you read the Quran and you understand the history of what's going on there, he's actually a conqueror. And that's how Islam spread, by the sword, through the Middle East and through North Africa. So there are two very different visions of what constitutes a martyrdom. And we as Christians need to be clear about what our conception of that actually is. Okay, now I'm going to talk about some cases. I often shock people when I speak about martyrs because both of my books start with chapters on a country that you would never anticipate as being a place where there are numerous martyrs. And do you know what it is? Take a guess. Consuelo. Right. Consuelo is Mexican. Bob is married to a Mexican, and it's Mexico. Mexico, people don't realize this. After the Mexican Revolution in the early part of the 20th century, they were the first socialist state, and they repressed the church like crazy. If you've ever read Graham Greene, the British novelist's book, The Power and the Glory, it's a very powerful representation of what it was like to live under that regime. I mean, you had governors of states that were naming their children Satan and Lucifer, and I mean, it was just a diabolical thing. Well, fortunately, that official persecution has receded somewhat. But Mexico today, people study these categories very, very carefully. Mexico today is the most dangerous place in the world to be a Catholic priest, in this sense. I mean, Nigeria is a terrible persecutor. If there were Catholic priests, maybe there are, maybe there aren't in North Korea or China. But the number of priests, the country that in which the largest number of priests are killed year after year right now is Mexico. It has nothing to do with the state, or very little to do with the state. It has everything to do with cartels, with criminality in general, with drug trafficking, human trafficking, all those things that you read about in a secular context, and you don't realize that, like Litvinov and like this Pino Pugliese, there are people in Mexico, or there are priests in Mexico who are standing up to this criminality, trying to protect people from being trafficked or whatever. And, these criminal gangs, which are mafias, basically, they don't like it. And they kill them. I mean, these are documented. They're worth reading into. You can read some of the cases in my book. And there's something even worse going on. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but there's actually now a kind of a inverted, I would call it demonic image of the Virgin Mary. I mean, here's Mexico, Our Lady of Guadalupe, the great devotion to Our Lady. But there's now if you look this up, Santa Muerte, it's called. Santa Muerte, Holy Death. It's the worship of this kind of devilish-looking woman. And people are sacrificed to her. Crimes are committed on her behalf. Oddly, it may be that this movement started in the prisons in Los Angeles, of all places. and then was re-imported back into Mexico. Although it also, in the ways that these things work, it also looks like some of the pre-Columbian um, Aztec and other religious elements have been built into this as well. But it's a very strange thing. And, it's worth pointing out because very often the kind of things that lead to martyrdom are not what you would expect. I mean, Mexico is an extremely Catholic country. If you go down there, there are churches all over the place, shrines all over the place, devotions, pilgrimages, processions, and yet it could exist alongside this horribly violent activity. As I said before, before the apprehension of Maduro in Venezuela, Venezuela was persecuting priests like crazy. Cuba and Nicaragua are doing the same thing. And in many of these places, what we're seeing is that kind of oblatio vitae, that you wouldn't expect these countries to be places because they're very Catholic. Venezuela, even Cuba. I've been to Cuba. I was there when John Paul was there in 1990. It's a very Catholic country still in a variety of ways, but also shot through with other difficulties. Okay, I want to move on to the Middle East now, because obviously that's one of the places that we have some of the worst persecutions. Let me start with, these are two martyrs in the Middle East. You may wonder why it is that all of a sudden there has been so much Christian persecution. Christians have existed in the lands that we call the Middle East, going all the way back to the beginning. St. Paul has his conversion experience on the road to Damascus in Syria. All those Christian communities, even under the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, I think, ruled Turkey from 1299 to 1922, I think, roughly, let's say. So, almost 700 years. And the Ottomans, although they were Muslim and they exacted the jizya, which is the tax that they impose on non-Muslims, it was a live and let live society. There's a lot of pressure on non-Muslims, but they pretty much allowed them to live. And actually, the taxes the Christians were forced to pay to Muslim leaders helped them stay in business because it was a very lucrative source of revenue for them. So they actually liked to have Christians around. So there were millions of Christians in what we now call Syria and Iraq, etc. The problem was that when Turkey collapsed after World War II in 1922, there was immense chaos in the Middle East. I'm sure many of you know a lot about this, maybe more than I do myself. But those things we now think of as countries were just regions at the time. And they had to be managed so that they were managed by the countries that won World War I. France basically took over the administration of Lebanon and of Syria. The British took over the management of what we think of as Palestine and Jordan and I think Iraq. And so, they tried to establish a certain order there. But little by little, of course, those peoples wanted to be independent and they became independent. And what happened is instead of transitioning to kind of more modern states, Lebanon actually did make a transition at the very beginning. They became the kind of playgrounds of warlords and dictators. And so this is what began to increase the pressure on Christians in all those different countries. And in particular, with the rise of Islamism, the Islamic State in the Levant, which was ISIL, and ISIS is a term more familiar with us. When those two radical movements, they're really part of the same thing. When those radical movements got going, that's when Christians really began to suffer under Islamic pressures. And it happened in a variety of ways. If you look, I'm going to try to pull out. Yeah, there we go. These are two figures in Iraq that I want to point to. This is Father Ragid Ghani. He's one of these priests. We're kind of all familiar with this kind of priest. He was a brilliant man. He did his service in the Iraqi army as everybody had to. And I think he studied to be an engineer. He was a very bright guy, but he had a vocation. And so he studied as much as he could in the Middle East, and then he moved to Rome. And he was actually on a scholarship from Aid to the Church in Need at the Angelicum, which is the Dominican university in Rome. He did a PhD there. He lived at the Irish College at one point. And he was so well liked, he learned English, French, Italian, that he got multiple offers to leave Iraq and to become a priest in Switzerland, France, various other places. But he was the kind of guy who just said, no, I have to go back and be with my people. So he did. And his bishop, I'm going to be going back and forth between these two. Bishop Paulus Farah made him his priest secretary. He was clearly on the track to be a bishop himself at some point, and he made him a pastor of a parish in northern Iraq, which was traditionally on the Mesopotamian plain, traditionally very Christian. Well, Father Gani started to receive death threats right away, and I mean very pointed death threats, bullets mailed to him, people stopping him and telling him to stop activity as a priest or he's going to die. At one point, people came up to him and they said to him, "Why won't you close your church?" And he said, "I can't close the house of God. My people need to be there." So the story about him is that he, on a Sunday, had his picture taken. He was going to go, I don't remember now whether he was going to have his license renewed or a passport. And he gave one copy to his mother and father. And they said, "Well, you know what?" He said, "Keep this. You can use it for my funeral." So he took off. He was on his way back to his parish. And he and the three of his bodyguards were killed by ISIS at that point. They were shot in their car. And as if that wasn't enough, his bishop, Bishop Paulus Farah, and I just want to go back here. That's Father Gandhi. And this is the bishop. Just a few weeks later, the bishop himself was kidnapped. I mean, we read about these kidnappings, in various Muslim countries these days. Sometimes it's just criminals who want money. But in the bishop's case, too, this was a hatred of Christianity per se. And this might actually be the old style in odium fidei, where it is a theological clash. They threw him in the back of a car. And somehow he was able to he had his cell phone with him, and he called his office and he told the people there, "Don't pay the ransom. The ransom money is better spent on the poor. Don't pay the ransom. I don't care what they ask you. I'll be willing to suffer." And of course, a few weeks later, he was found in the trunk of a car. So these are the kinds of people that, as I say, are still willing to die for the faith right now. And if you start to read into this, you almost can't believe. Priests are attacked on the altar. One was actually killed in a confessional while he's forgiving the sins of people in Iraq. And even over and above the martyrdom, there's all kinds of tortures. People's limbs are cut off. They're tortured in various ways. And when you read into this, you really begin to appreciate what it's like, not just to be a martyr when you're killed, but to live in circumstances in which every day you could be martyred. I think it's a heroic witness that it's like nothing else that exists in the world. These are not people who are walking around with bodyguards the way our politicians do here in the West and elsewhere. These are people who are exposed. They know they're exposed and they still carry out their activities. But let me move on a little bit. In 2006, you may recall that Pope Benedict gave a remarkable lecture at Regensburg, which was his own old university where he'd been a professor. And he talked about how there is no compulsion in religion. And in the Muslim world, this is a fictional dialogue between a Byzantine emperor and an official of Islam. And so it's a 500 or 600-year-old story, and yet it touched off all kinds of problems in the Muslim world. There's a particular case. I think I have a picture of her. Yeah, here she is. This is an Italian nun. Her name was Sister Leonetta Sgorbati, and she was in Somalia at the time. Somalia to this day is one of the hellholes when it comes to Christian persecution. She was a nurse. She'd been working in Islamic countries for years, but not trying to proselytize, just trying to bring healthcare as a Christian witness to charity to these different places. She went to Somalia. She learned Somalian to speak. And not only was she caring for people there, she was training local Muslim women to be nurses so that they also could take care of the people in Somalia, which is a very poor country and doesn't have much of a healthcare system. But in the aftermath of the Regensburg Address, and I think we need to take very seriously to heart that this kind of thing can happen at any time. An armed group, as she was leaving for lunch one day from the hospital, she was crossing a road with her bodyguard, who was a Muslim. The two of them were gunned down and killed. And in the ambulance that was taking her away, she was saying to the medical staff there, "I forgive them. Tell them I forgive them." I want to bring up another interesting case. Now, I want to say I have no authority to declare anybody a saint or martyr, so we have to wait for the church to make decisions about this. But I always think that there's some interesting cases like James Foley, who was an American, who we ought to pay some attention to. James Foley was a Catholic guy who grew up, I think, in New England. He went to Marquette University in Wisconsin, and he became a photojournalist. And the reason he became a photojournalist, he told his mother, he was a very serious Catholic, was he said, "I want to show people what it's like in war." So he went to Libya, and in the chaos of Libya after Gaddafi, he gets picked up by some Muslim group or other, and he gets put in prison. And he finds out when he's in prison that it actually stimulates his Catholic faith. He said, "I began praying the rosary on my knuckles the way my grandmother would have done it." And there are a lot of cases in the world, Solzhenitsyn and many others, who in prison discover God. And he was always a Catholic, but he kind of discovered God in an even deeper way. But happily, he was released. But he then decided he would go to Syria. Poor man. And he was picked up again. This time it wasn't just 2 weeks, and he just didn't kind of get a rap on the knuckles. This time he was there for many months. There were negotiations by the American government to try to get him free. But this was the period during which ISIS and ISIL were rising and trying to create a caliphate in Syria and Iraq and elsewhere. And so he was beheaded on camera. I don't know if any of you remember this. So we remember those Orthodox Christians in Libya, where on the beach, there were 29 of them, and Pope Francis declared them Catholic martyrs immediately, even though it's a little not kosher for the Catholic Pope to declare Orthodox martyrs. But I think what Francis said is there is a ecumenism of blood in the modern world, and that's a very trenchant way to put it, I think. Anyway, I just wanted to bring up James Foley because here's an American, right, who I think in that third category or second category of new martyrs is carrying out kind of a secular activity, but he's doing it because he's a Catholic and he wants to show the truth about what warfare is like. Unfortunately, a coalition was able to kind of push back radical Islam in the Middle East. It's still there. It's there in Syria. It's there in Iraq. But it's much, much less, of course, since about 2019. And what happened after that uprising of radical Islam was squelched is it largely moved to Africa. So it was kind of imported. And when you read about Nigeria, thank God people are actually paying attention now to Nigeria, which produces by far the largest number of Catholic and other Christian martyrs in the entire world, combined, actually. When I first wrote this book, I think the year before I wrote it, there were 5,000 documented Christians who had been martyred in Nigeria. I think since I've written it, it's probably 3 times that many because it's been increasing. And you see the same rhetoric in these places. They talk about creating a caliphate, an Islamic radical caliphate in Africa. Nigeria is the most conspicuous case because Nigeria, which is a huge country, by the way, it's got a population of 250 million. It's the largest population of any country in Africa. And it's almost equally divided between Christians and Muslims. And in the South, which is where most of the Christians are, you see very little persecution and outright martyrdom. On the border and in the North, where Islam is dominant, those states, they have states within the country like we have states within the United States. Those states are allowed, if they wish, to be run under Sharia law. And so they were. They are, they're places where people are beheaded. You see all the time people being accused of blasphemy. Whole schools of Christian girls are kidnapped and, you know, sometimes held for money, sometimes murdered, sometimes sold into slavery, raped, you know, all those things. And it's not only in Nigeria, it's also in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, Somalia, and others. But I want to mention just two cases that I think are emblematic. I think these are really, you know, they just really touch the heart. And one of them is this Michael Nadi. So he was only 19 years old when he was martyred. He was a seminarian. And so he was kidnapped along with several of his other seminarian friends. They were released or escaped somehow, but he remained in custody. And he was adamant. You know, there's a thing called the Shahada in Islam that if you say there's only one God and Muhammad is his prophet, when you say that, then they can't kill you because you now have become a Muslim. If you professed faith in Islam. He wouldn't do it. In fact, he told these armed guys, and they're standing around him with guns, you are doing evil. You're an embarrassment to Islam. You should be ashamed of yourself. A 19-year-old kid, like a student here at Seton Hall. So they shot him. And afterwards, the Nigerian police were actually able to arrest the people who killed him. And the guy who actually pulled the trigger said he was really moved by the Christian bravery of this young man. Now, how people like this come about, I don't know. I don't think I said. He was telling those people, you should become Catholic, not I should become Muslim. You should become Catholic, a 19-year-old boy. Outstanding bravery. Amazing. Here's another case. Father Vincent Machosi. I pick him out of a whole bunch of others because he studied here in the United States. He was doing a doctorate in, I think, ecumenical theology at Boston University. He was kind of midway through his studies, and he decided he had to go back. He was not in Nigeria. He was in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He decided he had to go back, and what he did was very interesting. And again, this is one of those things that out of a Christian understanding of wanting to promote justice and the truth, he decided he would document some of the atrocities being committed against Christians there. So he got his cell phone and he would take pictures of things that had happened. He'd put them online. And his religious order, the Assumptionists, said to him he couldn't identify himself as an Assumptionist because they had something like, I think, 15 other priests in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and there would have been repercussions against them. So he just made it look like it was him as a priest who was responding to these atrocities that were carried out. He says at one point, he records this, in many villages, 3/4 of the women had been raped by soldiers. And women, boys, and men were forced by militia to dig for the highly prized ore coltan, which is essential for the manufacture of cell phones. So again, this looks like it's in the secular category, but it's really something much deeper than that. The people who knew him at Boston College said he was a very outgoing, cheerful, kind of engaging man. They were all surprised that he left, but he just said, I have to go back because my people need it. He actually told his Assumptionist superior in Rome, and I'm quoting here, pray for me because I will be murdered. I feel it, but like Christ, for the sake of our people, I will not be silent. That's martyrdom. 30,000 people showed up at his funeral. And you can see from this picture, he was elected the chief or I don't know what we call it, the mayor of whatever village this is. You can just see that those people are around him and they love him. Now, unfortunately, that militant Islam has not even, after it migrated from the Middle East to Central Africa, it also migrated into Southeast Asia. So you start to see in places that actually used to be fairly moderate. I remember back when I went to Washington about 30 years ago, and Islam wasn't all that big a deal before 9/11, but we would talk about, radicalism in the world. And people used to say, well, Southeast Asia, non-Arab Islam is more moderate. It's kind of, it's gentler and it's more engaging. Unfortunately, that same pressure of radicalism moved out into Southeast Asia as well. So communities that used to live side by side with one another, I cite in my book, there's a retired Malaysian diplomat who talks about growing up as a child. And the way he describes it reminds me of the United States. He said, I had friends who were Protestant and Catholic and Muslim, and as children, we got along with one another. When we were adults, we knew one another. He says all that has now disappeared because there was a radicalization of these interactions with different groups. Really quite tragic cultural tragedy as well. Pakistan. Pakistan is one of these countries that in its own constitution has several categories of blasphemy. So there are blasphemy laws built into the Constitution of Pakistan. And people who work on international human rights have been, banging the drum for years that the West and other nations need to put pressure on Pakistan because there are these constant accusations of blasphemy where a Muslim perhaps wants to get revenge on a Christian. There's a famous case of Asia Bibi. She was condemned to death apparently for saying something against Islam, and she apologized about it. It wasn't a very big deal, but it became an international cause because, there she is. Because it was clear that this was all trumped up. And in Pakistan, what happens very often is the police will arrest somebody, maybe not even because they want to prosecute them, but because they want to protect them. So they go to jail. There's a trial, which is a kangaroo court, and they get convicted and they languish in jail until things calm down. And, often they're released. And in her case, they weren't releasing her. It looked like they were going to execute her, and an international pressure was brought on Pakistan, and they eventually released her. She was, I think, now living in Canada. And one of the reasons that she was released is that another martyr in Pakistan, and she's kind of a white martyr. You know what a white martyr is? It's somebody who's persecuted but doesn't actually get killed. And that was Asim. Shahbaz Bhatti is an extremely important man, I think, in 21st century Christian witness. He was a Catholic. His family were all Catholic. His father was a military officer in Pakistan. And from his earliest youth, Shahbaz Bhatti believed in the equality of everybody, whatever your religion. So when he was in university, he started a group that would protect the rights of all groups in the country. And when Pakistan decided to establish a minister of, I forget what they call this, minister of equality, of ethnic equality, they chose him. And so he was involved in a variety of cases. Of course, he was getting threatened left and right. And he was putting tremendous pressure on the Pakistani government to release Asia Bibi. And in his turn, he was shot one day going to work. But an important man, someone to really keep in mind and actually pray about. So I think he's likely to be one of our saints. His brother is actually a doctor who was practicing in Rome, and I think maybe now I've taken over his ministry. Well, I don't want to go on too long because you probably have some questions, but let me just very quickly say, remember the cases of China. There are at least 10 Catholic bishops missing in China. Look for Nina Shea's work. Nina works at the Hudson Institute in Washington. She's been tracking China very closely. But I want to conclude with something that many of you may not associate with martyrdom. And that is, I think, we need in the West itself to be alert to what's going on. Because we've had, I'm sure a lot of you know the case of Father Jacques Hamel, who had his throat cut while he was saying Mass in Normandy, in France. There was these two young Muslim guys in the region. Actually, he got along pretty well with the Muslims that were in that area of France. But they'd been radicalized, looking online as all sorts of people are. I mean, the guy who just tried to shoot Trump, I think, was radicalized online too. They came in and they cut his throat. And it's said that the last thing that he said was, Va-t'en, Satan, get away from me, Satan. Pope Francis immediately called him a saint, said that his images should be put up in churches throughout France. But right after this happened, 3 more Catholics were attacked in Nice in a church, had their throats cut, died. So this goes on and on in the West. You'll hear about this in other countries as well, Italy, Germany. France, which has a large Muslim population, loses 2 religious buildings per month to arson. 2 religious buildings a month. And the French government puts millions of euros into protecting those religious sites, and they still are attacked. In fact, Notre Dame, Father Stravinskas knows I've raised the question mark about whether that was an accident when Notre Dame burned. But let's say for the sake of argument, it was. When Notre Dame was rebuilt and it was about to be opened, the French terrorist police stopped another radical Islamic attack that was going to burn it again just before it was going to be reopened again. So this is the kind of thing that even in our Western societies, we need to pay a great deal of attention to. And I'll just leave you with this thought. There's a lot of pressure on Christians in the West. We know this even here in the United States. Our own government puts pressure on, you can hardly believe this, the Little Sisters of the Poor, right? I mean, they're supposed to cover contraception or abortion or whatever. And there are other groups like this. I think in New York, there's, which is the group in New York? The Dominican Sisters of Hawthorne, yeah, right. So look, these are little signs. We're obviously not being persecuted the way people are in other parts of the world. Thank God that our Supreme Court generally does protect religious liberty. But our own bishops have done studies of attacks against churches and shrines here in the United States. And over a 4 or 5 year period, the study that they did, there were almost 500 cases here in the United States. I work with a group in Europe that's called OIDOC. It's the Observatory for, I have it written here, I won't bother. They observe anti-Christian activity in Europe. They're located in Vienna in Austria. And I worked with them as I was developing this book. They have documented using the EU's criteria for what constitutes a hate crime. They've documented almost 900 in 2024, over 1,000 in 2025, and probably close to 1,500 this year by the time the year is over. So this stuff is creeping along. In Canada, there's a lot of restriction on speech, these days, and there's, I think, a presumption against Christianity. There's this famous case of ground radar allegedly showed that there were these mass graves outside of these governmental schools up in Canada, and that allegedly, because of mistreatment by nuns, sorry to say the sisters, all these children had been mistreated and died. Well, it turns out that no one has discovered a single mass grave yet, and yet 40 churches burned in Canada as a result. There was an assumption of that. Pope Francis went there and apologized. It wasn't true. And I'll just leave you with this thought. There are 2 reasons I think that people in the West don't pay attention to martyrs. One is they're not, the people who cover religion don't, people who are public journalists don't believe that religion is important. And I think that there's a kind of a subtle racism about other countries. They think, Africa, Middle East, Asia, they don't have orderly societies anyway. And there's a kind of a subtle, I'm going to call it racism. But the other thing, and this is my last point, is I think that there's an assumption among many of our leaders, political cultural, universities, etc., that Christianity is mostly a history of evil. I mean, the West, and they also think it's mostly a history of evil. It's an extreme exaggeration to the obvious imperfections that exist in both the church and in our civilization. So when something happens, I'm not going to put it the way Rod Dreher does, that, you deserve it, is what they think. But there is kind of this sense that, Christians are finally getting their own. So I'll just leave you with these thoughts, that it's incumbent on all of us to learn more about Christian persecution and the sort of creeping, pressure on Christianity. And not only to learn about it, but to do something about it, in whatever way that might be. And I'll repeat what I said at the beginning, either to learn more about these things, but ultimately to do something. Even if you put something on your credit card for relief efforts in Africa or the Middle East, we all need to find some way to be more active about one of the supreme groups of witnesses to our faith. That group of people who are still willing, like Jesus did, to die for the truth of God and for our salvation. These are the martyrs of the 21st century. So thank you.